really loved your book, by the way, and I thought it was very beautiful, very eloquent, and I really liked the combination of this very intimate, personal observations with sort of philosophy and high abstraction. And
yeah, the book was really for me an attempt to see the experience as a whole, the becoming a young chess player and being highly driven to win. So developing this strong competitive urge, which was also about advancement and identity and personal growth. And then at some point, partly through becoming a father, partly through just growing up, beginning to realize there were other ways to live your life, that it wasn't just about your next competitive victory. So that was the book. In some ways is making sense of those different impulses. On the one hand, the natural competitive urge to win and the excitement of all that.
Yeah.
Then sort of saying goodbye to it as well. Sort of.
Well, I noticed that there's this kind of paradox in your character, right? The chess being extremely hyper competitive and almost warrior-like, and actually, what really matters to you is the more carrying aspect of life on some level.
Possibly, yeah. So as you probably know, the warrior archetype is partly about a kind of sublimation. It's partly about finding something that's worth living for and focusing all your energy on that and mobilizing as if at war for that end. So that spirit of, single-minded attention, I've got a lot of respect for it. I see it in people. I see its power. I see how it can forge great progress. I see how it can cut through a lot of noise. I admire it, and I think it's a necessary energy in the world. I also think there's more to life, and something somewhere along the way that ceased to make as much sense to me. That desire. I remember one time being in a hotel room in Spain, and I mentioned this in the book, and just sort of trying to get ready for the next game, trying to find that warrior who wanted to win and wanted to win the tournament and beat the guy next. And I just noticed that that wasn't me anymore. I still respected it. I could still just about pretend to be that person. But I began to think there are bigger battles to be fought and won. So,
do you think being a full-on warrior has more to do with the grace of learning how to lose in some sense, or learning how to be broken, or learning how to lose gracefully? Because none of us sort of rise to the extreme, image of ourself,
right.
Become the divine double. There's a word that John Vervaeke was using. And so we always fall short of that on a human level, and becoming human in some sense has to do with failure as much as
right.
winning.
Yes. So there's, as you probably know, in the book, The Moves That Matter, there was a little bit of an anti-heroic side to it. It's partly about me coming to terms with the fact that I was never going to be world champion. And I didn't really ever try or ever have a very serious chance at that. But there were maybe moments of inflection when, after a particularly big tournament or a great run, I might have got ideas that, maybe I can go all the way. But at some point, you kind of reach your limitations. You play people, and you know that was no accident that you lost that game. You may learn, you may play a bit better next time, but there are clear limitations. And I think that's true in almost any dimension of life. Better philosophers, better activists, better fathers. I think it's something about growing up that you come to appreciate your strengths and weaknesses and get to know yourself a bit better as a result. For me in chess, it was something about letting go of that ultimate desire to be more at ease with what had happened.
Right. Is it also something to do with, at one point, deciding to let go of being a specialist in one field? I know in my 20s, I wanted to be a songwriter. It was like I was driven to that. It was the only thing I cared about. And then at one point, I came to the realization that, I got married, and all these other things happened to me, which made it impossible to be so one-pointedly devoted to that one goal. And my life became more diverse and rich, but I couldn't concentrate on that one thing to the degree that I wanted to. So
yes, that's very pertinent, because it reminds me of the quotation, I think, by Joseph Campbell, who asked, which myth are you living by?
Yeah.
And I think in the case of my younger self, this single pointed attention, this mobilized the will and the heart and the soul and the mind to get as good as possible at this one thing, chess. That was very much part of the story. It was about, let me show the world that I can focus. Let me show the world that I can dedicate myself to this through discipline. And there's a lot of self-love in that, for good and bad. There was a sort of genuine discipline and formation of character. Without chess, that wouldn't have happened. On the other hand, that monomania, that sense that A, I was really important, B, the game is really important, and C, the next game and the next move really mattered. These were all kind of part of the myth, and at some point you begin to realize you're telling the story of yourself, and there are other ways of telling that story. So yes, marriage was part of it. Doing, my educational activities was part of it. Chess was always a kind of plan B, even when I didn't really have a plan A. It was like, I didn't know what plan A was yet, but I just knew that chess wasn't it. It was more like what I was doing when I wasn't doing something else.
Interesting. I was thinking as you were talking about my recent discussion with Zach and John, and we talked about this notion of the divine double. And towards the end of the conversation, Zach was mentioning that the divine double is multiple. It's not. Yeah. It's not just one. It's not. You're not just one person. You're many different people. Right. You're many different archetypes that you're trying to become, and they're often in conflict with each other.
Absolutely.
So maybe when you're younger, you're focused towards just that one, and then when you get older, you have a wider view of the archetype.
So I mean, I think that sounds roughly right, and I watched that conversation, and I know that quite well, and the notion that the psyche is plural is worth just taking a while to sit with, because it's plural in several different ways. Zach's speaking in quite a sort of archetypal, maybe post-Jungian kind of way.
Yeah.
And he's trying to say that I think once you go into the psyche more deeply, you find that there are these competing energies. And then the question is, well, who is observing them? Who's mediating between them? Mm-hmm. Is there such a thing? Is the self just that conversation between for example, your warrior, your wizard, your dysfunctional child, your, whatever else.
Your masculine and feminine.
But even more basically, your consumer and your shopper, your cleaner, and, the parts of you that are not so, exalted or mysterious.
Yeah. And
they're all kind of battling it out to be who you are. And sometimes it feels like the right version of yourself prevails, and sometimes it doesn't, But what was there? Where I think Zach and John's conversation was going, at least that's where my mind was taking it, was this question of the witness. Who is observing this plural psyche? Mm-hmm. Does it make sense? Is the psyche just plural? Are we merely a conversation, mm-hmm. or is there a sense in which someone's witnessing that conversation, or something, or
right?
This got me intrigued,
Yeah. Well, I remember the mystic Gurdjieff says man is legion. Right. But he also said there should be one sort of central controller who's looking at those other multiple personalities and is in control and saying you should do this or you shouldn't do this. Otherwise, we get swept away. All right, we get lost in the chaos.
True, and yet that looks scarily like a kind of old-fashioned view of a Cartesian self who's in charge of everything, right? Yeah. So I think it might be more mystical than that. It might be that those archetypal selves that are somehow in our psyche, conversing among themselves, competing and collaborating in various ways. I suspect the holding pattern for them is something transpersonal. It may even be spirit in some sense, or there are lots of words for it, being, or God, or but something that's not merely personality, beyond the personality.
Right. Yeah. That seems very important. That it seems to me that there's a need to connect with that in the modern times where we're so obsessed with personality. We're so
Yeah. So I mean, you mentioned the Spiritualise book. I think my favorite single line, perhaps, although there are several, about what spirituality was from the Buddhist psychoanalyst Mark Epstein.
Mm-hmm.
And he says spirituality is whatever takes you beyond the personality.
Yeah.
I find that quite astute, and it stayed with me a little bit.
Because I guess the personality, you can develop it. You can develop it a lot, but it still remains a prison if you don't go beyond that on some level.
Yeah, and what's beautiful is, I mean, I can't speak from personal experience as such, but I think somewhere in my book I also mentioned this. There's quite a well-worn line that says you have to be somebody before you can be nobody. And the contention is that somehow the self has to be constructed and coherent to some extent before it's deconstructed.
Yeah.
And if you go straight towards deconstruction, you just have this chaos. And I think that line is good, but what a little twist on it, I think, is that you find that when you meet the nobodies, as it were, the advanced spiritual practitioners, the people considered wise, they actually have radiant personalities. It's just that it's sort of not self-consciously held anymore. It's sort of it's there, but it's no longer a project.
It's no longer fear-based.
Fear-based, and it's not adapting to the world. They're not using this personality as a kind of tool to filter out experience. It's more like once they've gone beyond the need to do that, they still show up with their own quirks and So I think,
at the risk of sounding sentimental, it everything. I guess the most developed being would be the one who's just at service to the world in love, if I could say that.
Well, quite. Although, like you say, the risk of sentimentality. Where are we with that? Because I find myself wanting to say things like, love is of fundamental significance, find out what you can serve, and so forth. But then we live in such a self-conscious culture that I also think, well, that sounds a bit worthy,
Yeah, and love has such a kind of gross, when we talk about love, it has a sentimental flavor to it. Whereas there's a fierceness to it, there's a directness to it, there's there's a softness, there's both aspects, I think.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be sentimental or sappy or
not at all.
In the sense that I mean, or in the sense of the person you're talking about who has embodied that.
No. I mean, I think love, properly understood, is that which brings us to tears. I think it's the feeling we have when we sense we've given our all and are deeply grateful, and these kind of feelings of self-overcoming. But I'm also reminded of the beautiful quotation by Martin Luther King about love and power. You probably know it, but in essence, he speaks about the problem with the world being that we've just defined and understood power to be sort of the absence of love, and love to be the absence of power, as if they were somehow polar opposites.
Didn't he call it soul power or something like that? Yeah,
possibly that may be somewhere else. But he has a famous quotation that's in Spiritualise, and I might even have put it in the Moves That Matter because I like it so much. But he just says the challenge of our time is bringing love and power together, and figuring out what that means. And it's an ongoing project, but it is about what does it mean to love and serve the world at the moment.
Sorry to interrupt. I thought that might be a good segue to talk about your activism or your interest in kind of bringing spirituality into politics. So I wanted to ask you about that, partly because it's a weakness in my own life, is that I tend to be apolitical, right. And I tend to think that's a weakness of mine, and maybe you can help me with that. How do we bring spirituality into actual political action?
Right. Well, I've been thinking about this for at least 5 years now, and the first thing I would say is that I think that without wanting to finesse the term too much. Having used the word spirituality for several years, I began to realize there was something problematic, not about the reference to the spiritual, not about spiritual practice or spiritual experience, or even spiritual knowledge or beliefs, but spirituality as a complex composite noun is actually a deeply problematic term. It's misleading.
Yeah.
You say spirituality, you're placing it in the world of tables and chairs as a thing that exists in the world with its own objective reality.
It also has a Gnostic flavor, doesn't it? It's dividing spirit from matter.
Right. There's that too. And people get people get concerned about it because they're concerned about spiritualism and spirits and metaphysical features of the term. Mm-hmm. So the first thing to say is that I tend these days to refer to spiritual sensibility and the challenge of cultivating that. What does it mean to have spiritual sensibility? And by that I mean a kind of feature of how we are disposed to be. To what extent do we push our inquiry to our cosmological framework as a whole, our deepest values, our strongest and most resonant experiences. So when I say spiritual sensibility, I mean a kind of feature of how we relate to the world. And I don't think that kind of sensibility is in any sense controversial. All that is required to have spiritual sensibility is to be interested in the meaning of life. Yeah. And to be interested in the cultivation of virtue and to be interested in the nature of reality. Yeah. And most people have these things. It's just that at any given moment they have them to greater or lesser extent.
But religion seems to be the thing that's problematic these days. I mean,
right. So yes, and when I was doing the spirituality project, there was an anthropologist called Matthew Engelk in the room in one of our workshops. And I'll never forget the moment where we were floundering around with definitions and, what is it about spirituality? Why is it a problem? And he says, well, guys, the word spiritual has a history, and that history has a politics. And this is the heart of the matter. Spirituality is closely related to religion, which is deeply political and historical as an institution. So we've come a bit off the original question. So let me try and weave this back to that.
Okay.
About the relationship between the spiritual and the political. It's like this. If you, without getting too deep into the diagnosis of the world, we have a certain kind of political economy in advanced Western world. We have a certain kind of social imaginary, which is something to do with consumerism and individualism and personal freedom and ownership. It's about nation states. It's about legal systems. We have certain notions of what's normal. Yeah. And we've also gone through a historical period where we decided that the ideological battle was somehow won, and that liberal democratic capitalism, broadly conceived, was somehow the answer.
The end of history.
Right. So I sometimes even joke on the end of history that we're all Fukuyama's children, right? And I obviously I don't mean that literally, but I just mean that you and I and many people of sort of similar age grew up thinking that we may have reached the end of history, or at least that was a contention. Yeah. At least it was a possibility. I'm not sure I ever really bought it, but clearly that's not the case today. Right?
Well, also, can I just interject? Also, we've gone through postmodernism, which has been a critique of everything. So we believe, but we don't believe. There's a kind of there's the modern project, and then Zach calls it I think he called it
post-tragic, right?
Post-tragic, right?
Yeah. Well, so there's too much to talk about, but the way I would try and complete the initial point is that what changed really was waking up to the influence of ecology, technology, and finance. And we could get lost in that. But in essence, ecological constraints, ecological collapse, finance sort of subverting, we think of the economy, and your kind marketing version is like the market stall, where people are trading goods and services, and some are getting prosperous and some are having their needs met, right? That's your kind of folk capitalism.
Yeah.
But what we have today is something more like surveillance, extractive, kleptocratic, plutocratic, data-driven, inequality-driving, socially corrosive capitalism, right? Yeah. So it's not necessarily the underlying logic of the market that's problematic. It's something about what this beast has become. And then on top of that, you have the influence of technology, which is implicated in both ecology and in finance. But in essence, technology is now changing within generations rather than just between them. So you have these destabilizing influences, right? And in that context, it feels like the modernist project, the project that said, look, we'll have nation states, we'll have a free market, the individual has certain rights, we'll have private property, everyone will be all right, go about your business, right? That world is sort of broken. That story has been proven to be inadequate.
Yeah, especially today with coronavirus. Oh my God. I mean, I don't want to bring that in too much, but that seems to be giving us a view of our limitations on all levels. It's like,
so
incredible.
Corona, it is incredible. And Corona, I'm happy to come to that in a second. That is definitely a reckoning. Yeah. The reckoning, though, prior to that, even just, look closely at the climate science and what it's asking of us politically, and you realize it's going to be extremely difficult to avoid much worse ecological cascading collapse.
Right. Yeah.
Look closely at the fact that the tech giants from Silicon Valley are now so powerful that, in effect, the public realm is now controlled by private actors. Right? And then look closely at how finance serves the democratic system and keeps perpetuating it in the way things are funded. Now, none of these points, I hasten to add, are coming from a particularly socialistic, communistic perspective. Coming from someone who, I'm fairly political, but to be honest, I couldn't really care who gets elected tomorrow or the next day. Yeah. It's a bit more like I want people to be kind of sane and less deluded. And I think there's a lot of delusion baked into the political system. So when you ask me, where does the spirituality come in? It comes in about getting beyond systemic delusion, sort of seeing into the problems of the world. But it's also about renewal. So it's about where are the resources, conceptual, experiential, solidaristic, relational, imaginative resources going to come from to survive and thrive for the next 100 years and beyond. And they're going to come from deep places, right?
Yeah, indeed.
And trusted places. And they'll be spiritual and to some extent religious too.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking that people are talking about the end of religion. I feel like we're at the beginning of religion in some level.
Well, this is interesting because I've my views on this have kind of evolved as I've grown up. About 6 or 7 years ago, when I began the spirituality project at the Royal Society of Arts in London, just to give a bit of context, that's a relatively conventional Enlightenment organization. And by conventional, I mean that in sort of an intellectual, cultural sense. It's kind of a cutting edge of the establishment, but still the establishment.
Yeah.
And it's also fairly rationalistic and even a bit technocratic. And in that context, I managed to raise the funds to create this project on rethinking spirituality on the basis of new understandings of human nature. That human beings are significantly more socialized, significantly more automatic, significantly more embodied than we previously thought. And by that I mean cognition is not deliberative and rational. It's something much more about an organism trying to get by in his group and achieve his goals and so forth. All of which to say, these new theories about what the human being is, I thought, should change our idea of what the spiritual life was about. And at that time, I confess, I did that because I thought religion was on the way out. I did because I thought, like, all of this old-fashioned religion, how absurd and quaint it seems now. But then I had a bit of a transformative set of encounters with lots of people. Some very devout Christians became very close friends, for example. My wife's religion, my wife's Indian and Hindu. Right. I began to look at that differently as a result too. intellectually, I'm relatively Buddhist. The books I'm drawn to are a bit more about understanding the finer points of experience in the mind.
Yeah.
And then because I've been to university for about 7 or 8 years, I'm quite skeptical. I'm quite not particularly credulous. So that mixture of experiences made me think a little bit differently about religion. Namely that, we have this extraordinary historical gift of these resources and traditions and institutions and practices. And the idea that that's all kind of old-fashioned hogwash is immature as hell.
Well, I feel that's immature. I was listening to this rabbi on YouTube that my wife likes to listen to, and he was talking about following the Torah. And I was thinking about how difficult that must be. Like what a challenge it is to follow a religious path, deeply. And we're almost too superficial to do this. Or I shouldn't say we, but the average North American or European, we think we're so intelligent and wise and advanced, but we couldn't possibly follow the Torah, Anyway, so there's this extreme depth that comes along with following a religious path, fully. And
I very much agree.
Fail at doing that, even though I try to.
But the irony, Andrew, the irony of that, I think, is that before you look too closely at it, it can look as if the barrier to entry to experiences and practices and community and tradition is sort of surrendering your intellect, right? It can look to some people like, all right, I kind of like your community, I quite like your songs, I might even have a bit of your wine, but don't give me any of that Jesus rose on the third day stuff, right?
Yeah.
But once you get to know the people a bit better and spend a bit more time there, you realize they're not that hung up on the beliefs. It's not. It comes into a more permeating set of experiences in which those beliefs begin to be a bit more resonant and meaningful. But it's not as if everything's driven by them, at least not in the more liberal churches that I've observed.
Yeah. But I could also say it also appears that there's a lot of dead religion out there that's just propositional and dogmatic and unbearable. And
I agree.
So I think living religion. I mean, when I said religion is going to come back, I don't mean that in a positive sense. I mean that it's like it's both, right? A kind of cultish spirit seems to be will arise in all of this chaos that we're getting right now, but also different communities of sense making and sense making is, you don't like that word. What was your word for sense making? I was trying to remember what it was.
I can't remember. It's funny. You're the second person today to tell me I don't like that term. It must be somehow out there. But
it was a tweet. It was a tweet.
I think intelligibility. I kind of I find that we have a challenge of intelligibility today to make sense of the world. But when people turn it into sense making, good luck to them. It's fine. It's not my concern to be dabbling in other people's languages. But for me, sense making sounds a bit phony.
Sounds a bit intellectual. It sounds a bit like, we'll just do this and we'll make sense, and that's gonna.
It turns it makes it sound like a practice. And I guess I remain to be convinced that it really is a practice. Perhaps it could be. Perhaps I just don't have the experiences that a sense-making process, properly understood, may be worthy of that name. I haven't yet experienced it yet. But I don't know if I answered your original question fully. But the way I was just going to say that in terms of whether religion's coming back. It's tricky, right? Because it depends on who you're talking to and how old they are and what they've been through. And for some people, religion is still a big allergy. Religion still means a potentially coercive source of authority who will take away your freedom. And what I realized quite recently, actually, and this is where the two worlds intersect a little bit. The term spirituality, it's sometimes even called spiritual but not religious. And and the thing that's interesting about that is it's an absurd expression, right? It's like being healthy but not medical, or learning but not through education, or something like that. And it's got this kind of deinstitutionalized feel to it.
Well, I guess we need to define what religion means, like to us, and what it really means. Rather than just being Christianity or Islam, or what does religion really mean? I mean,
you have other authorities there. You have religio, and I heard Zach and John speaking about that before. Religio often meaning sort of to bind together, or
the need for communal practices which lift up the spirit,
but also give you a kind of commitment device and reinforce your discipline, and give you a focal point and renew your commitment, that give you a certain tempo to existence, that structures your time and attention, that gives you clarity of purpose, that gives you social support. Lots of things about religion are fabulous.
And if you don't have that, you have a perverted version of that.
Right.
Often, or usually, or maybe always.
Right. It can manifest in other ways. But here's the point I wanted to make, and it's a point I haven't really articulated publicly before, so it's worth getting it right. But it's like this. Why is it that some people are so allergic to the term spirituality? And there are several reasons, but there's one that I would add, which is that spirituality is really liberalism's attempt to have a spiritual life without religion. Right? It's liberalism's way of saying we can have all the good stuff that you mentioned, all the good experiences.
Yeah, without the commitment.
Personal growth, without the commitment, without the place-based activities, without the family and community commitment, without the service. We're going to do the stuff that we enjoy because we're free agents and we can create our life however we want.
That's interesting, because that's all bound up in the whole Protestant notion of just you can make it up as you go along, or you can have a direct relationship to God, and you can have it all, right? You don't need the church, you don't need the doctrine, you don't need the...
I'm on, even more on the edge of my competence zone than usual, but on theology, I couldn't be sure, but I imagine there are those who would say that one of the things that makes Protestantism distinct is that there's a kind of sense-making capacity conferred on the agent. Mm-hmm. But it's not completely untethered from institutional support or practice or even community.
But maybe in its pathological form, maybe it has a very good aspect to it, the self-critical aspect, but as in pathological form, it leads to a kind of do-it-yourself spirituality, consumer spirituality, where you just get a bunch of techniques and you stitch them together in any patchwork that you like, and then you have a nice time, but you don't go very deep.
Right, so here's where this point needs to be understood fully, I think, because when I was a bit younger, I would have thought, well, what's wrong with that? Pick and mix, great. I'll have an eclectic view. Why can't I take the best of the best? And why can't I trust myself to forge it and build my own life around it? Mm-hmm. So that's a good question. And then you say to them, well, look, that is the essence of much of the liberal project.
That's a blank slate ideology, isn't it? I mean...
Well, it's not just a blank slate. I guess the point I'm making is that there's a connection between the individual desire to do that and liberalism's failure. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean these problems I mentioned earlier of technology controlling the public realm, private actors controlling the public realm, cascading ecological collapse, and kind of financial overreach in every aspect of our life, leading to socially corrosive inequality, democratic breakdown, and so forth. Those are on liberalism's watch, right? Mm-hmm. So when the person says, I want to do these things, that's still caught up in the liberal imaginary. It's still caught up in this idea that somehow being free in the private realm as a private agent to create your own spiritual life is absolutely fine because that's how we do things now.
Yeah, the myth of freedom.
It's not working, right? But the answer is it's not working very well. It's destroying society. It's destroying the social fabric. It doesn't mean there's nothing in it. It doesn't mean you go back to old-time religion and listen to the minister. Yeah. But it does mean think twice.
The question is maybe, so how do you have a spiritual or let's say religious life in the 21st century? That's kind of your question, isn't it?
My question really is, how do we bring matters of fundamental concern to bear on in the public realm, but in a way that connects
in the public
better,
realm.
But that word public realm is often used to avoid politics. I guess I mean in a way that has a bearing on the design of public policy. So to give you an example, there's a big debate within economics about whether economic growth is sustainable. Whether in order to cope on a finite planet, some believe that we can progressively make economic production cleaner with green energy and renewable materials, and that actually the
gross domestic product,
the perpetuation and continued growth of GDP, gross domestic product, is possible, and that and not only is it possible, but it's sort of essential. So the green growth advocates, and that theory to some extent is the basis for the Green New Deal, which is a big political hot potato in the US, and
still based on growth.
Right, still based on growth, and it gets to the question of what exactly is going on there. What is this growth doing spiritually? In what sense is it conferring reality on something? In what sense does it make us feel real or make life meaningful? Do we actually need it? And the reason that question matters is that I think when you look at the best models, and Tim Jackson, I'm associated with a university center here at the University of Surrey called the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. And the argument we have is it's not anti-growth. Again, it's not coming from a place of bring down these terrible capitalists. It's saying, look at the data, look at the evidence. It appears that there's a strong connection between one particular kind of economic growth and ecological degradation. We've known this for a long time. It's continuing. The link is there. To what extent can you decouple them, right? And the debate goes that there's no doubt you can decouple it in a relative sense, so that every given unit is a bit cleaner and a bit better than the previous one. But there is a big argument over whether you can reduce it in an absolute sense and decouple it such that in the globe as a whole, we can carry on growing and reduce, for instance, emissions, especially carbon emissions.
Okay, let's go back to coronavirus then, maybe, because...
Well, but hang on, if you don't mind, Anu, just
Sure. Excuse me, I'm just...
Because it's necessary to make the problem with the work that I do, and the work a lot of the people you speak to do, is to connect sort of disciplines and paradigms and contexts and epistemologies. It takes a bit of time, right? Because you've got to unpack the stall in both worlds, and then you forge the relationship, and then you analyze the relationship. But in this case, I'm just saying that if you take the growth debate, it would appear that the argument will be fought and won at the level of persuasive policy reasoning. Like this, if we have green growth, we'll have this number of jobs, and we'll have lower emissions, and this will be a good policy outcome, right?
Yeah.
But if you have it at a more existential level, about what are you actually living for? What is the good society? What is the good life?
Right.
It's very far from clear that the growth model is the way.
But that's not even in a part of the discussion, is it? It's just about let's say building engineering the utopia,
right?
And it's not about what's the meaning of this of our lives, like. And people assume if you just build the utopia, then we'll just all figure out what the meaning of life is. But I feel like even though there's a coronavirus, I'm in a nice little house in a French village, and I'm totally in a utopia, right? But I still have struggles. Sorry to make it personal. I just mean that
let's come to the personal.
Deep existential shit is what matters.
It matters, and it's been lost in the public realm. That's the kind of point. And the language of the spiritual is a way of saying, look, think of your fundamental questions of what I call in the book love, death, self, and soul. Which is, think of questions of being, becoming, beyondness, and I forget what the fourth one is, but anyway, but think of these fundamental processes in life, and where are we with them? Now, we're not going to resolve that. We're not going to say, okay, here's the meaning of life, and therefore we live like this.
Yeah.
But we do have to structure society in a way that is responding to ultimate questions of meaning and purpose. Part of the problem with liberalism, and I still am a functional liberal, by the way. It's not as though, I still love the freedom that liberalism has conferred. I'm just becoming more aware of its costs.
Yeah. Well, its cost is a kind of superficiality where you don't meditate on death, for example. I don't mean to be heavy, but we're in a situation right now where a lot of our elders are going to die.
Right. So it's time to talk about the virus, right?
I'm sorry, it just keeps coming up because it's a subtext to all these things you're talking about.
It is. So it is the kind of elephant in the room, as it were, except it's much smaller than an elephant. It's tiny microparticles that are causing the problem. Right. So the virus.
So the President Macron last night just told us that we're at war against the virus. So first of all, I thought, oh, Jesus Christ, it's like, are you trying to be like de Gaulle or something and using this outdated rhetoric? I think that the whole system is so stupid on a spiritual level, right?
Right.
I mean, we're at war against the virus. It seems to be the opposite is true. We're going to have to figure out how to
make peace,
cooperate, make peace with each other. Right. Anyway, but sorry for the rant, but
that's okay. That's okay.
I'll let you speak.
It's a difficult one for many reasons, but I mean, there's a lot going on, right? So there's Perspectiva's. Well, I tell you what. To loop it back, best way of doing this. One of your previous discussions with Zach, I believe he spoke a little bit about the educational meta-crisis.
Yeah.
And he spoke a little bit about four main questions he feels are defining of our time. So the kind of meta-crisis distilled into four questions. Those are very much his, but they partly came about through conversations we'd had. And the four questions really are, what's going on, roughly, which is a question of sense-making or intelligibility. Mm-hmm. There's a question of, are we up to it, which is basically about capability. Then there's like, who's in charge and who gets to decide, which is a question of legitimacy, or Zach calls it legitimation sometimes, quoting Habermas. And then finally, there's kind of meaning, or what's it all about? What are we trying to do, right? Mm-hmm. Now, these four questions can be superimposed on the virus.
Sure. Do you want to go through them? That's very interesting.
So I would say the intelligibility question, what's going on, is that we're doing that work reasonably well as a species, I think. It could be better, but there is a great deal of sense-making going on. And the challenge is not to rush to judgment about what is a good and bad response. But nonetheless, the problem there is, while you're making sense of things, what do, right? You can't wait for a month to figure out, to get all the data you need to make the fully informed judgment. You have to make a decision often with incomplete knowledge in the context of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And there the question is, that comes into a question of underlying values. I would say the first instinct should be care. And the first instinct should be kind of caritas rather than veritas. It's like protect what you love and then figure out what the attack is, what the threat is. So personally, I think very early on, when it became clear this was a new kind of infectious disease, a virus that was fatal for a small percentage of the population, that would grow exponentially over time because of the early patterning of increase over weeks.
They missed the exponential curve, kind of
I think
they weren't able to deal with that.
Either they missed it or they didn't know what it meant. But I think rather than waiting to make perfect sense, what's going on here is how does the human species as a whole deal with conditions of epistemic uncertainty, where we're still looking to authority to tell us what's going on, what do we do? But we can't do that, really. We can, to some extent, defer to experts, to some extent, look for the most reliable sources, but we still have to figure out for ourselves, do I send my son to school tomorrow or not?
Yeah.
And do I go shopping once a week? Is that safe, or should I wait until, who knows, till it's all cleared up? These questions are ultimately ours to answer, but they arise from the crisis of intelligibility, of not knowing what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's heightened at the time of the virus, but it's there all the time.
It's there all the time. Very interesting. Yeah.
That's the first thing. The second thing is on capability. There's real questions here about, are we up to it? Now, there's some really good stories here about capability, because 3D machines have been mobilized to create new kinds of medical equipment that wouldn't have been possible a long time ago. There are some signs that vaccination efforts are being accelerated.
Yeah.
There's already some evidence about things that we can take to reduce the chance of fatality if we catch it. So it's not as though the human species is not mobilizing a capability response.
Sure.
In many ways, we are up to this. We're also planning carefully to flatten the curve and reduce impacts on hospitals and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But it begs the question of, more generally, are we...
Wisdom.
Not yet, Andrew.
Not yet. We're not at wisdom yet. Okay. That was one of my questions for you. Okay, keep going.
Well, I don't know if you know, my PhD was on wisdom, so we'll probably come to that. But in the context of the virus, the capability question is, are we up to dealing with this in a way that minimizes harm? Now, that's not just about the medical response. It's also about the social and civic society response. Yeah. For example, enlightened governments would now be doing things like giving a temporary universal basic income to everyone, so that people are not going to work and getting infected, or going to school and getting infected because they have to pay their bills, right?
Yeah.
That you need to take that problem out of the equation. So there's a capability question that's heightened. Are we up to it? Right?
Yeah. Are we going to leave a lot of people behind, even if we solve the problem? People who can't afford to, pay the bills after losing their job.
Well, that comes to the next bit, legitimacy, because there are justice questions and fairness questions. The question of legitimacy looms large here, because it's about who gets to decide who lives and dies, on what basis, right? So the UK government, for example, appeared to make a decision that would put the elders, especially, and I call them the elders rather than the elderly, because
the elders, I think we need to talk about the elders. I'm just going to bracket that, because they're not the elderly. There are the elders. They're the history of our civilization.
Right.
They contain the knowledge. I mean,
totally.
You're looking at older people as elders, really.
Indeed. And yet they're sometimes described in a sort of sense that would make it look like they were dispensable. Indeed, yeah. And the same with underlying conditions. We use that term as if, we're already somehow halfway gone. But actually, I'm type 1 diabetic. I have an underlying condition. I know many of my family does too. And so this virus is a real and present danger to lots of people. And governments are making decisions that will have very direct bearings on who lives and dies. That's a legitimacy question, and it's heightened, right? Again. And then finally, the meaning crisis, which I'm sure will be the one that interests you the most. Yeah. But there, it's a direct encounter with death, right? Yeah. It's about the fact. Now, here's something that I learned from a conversation with Bonita Roy. I forget the precise context, but the idea that we can prevent death doesn't really stack up. At some level, we're all ultimately going to die. Yeah. And our deaths are in some ways a scandalous open secret that we are so utterly contingent, so dependent on a beating muscle that could stop beating at almost any time. So what the virus does is, again, heightens that experience. Suddenly it's like, hang on, I didn't think my life was a question mark, but the virus says it might be, right? Yeah. It's a kind of scandal, also a moment of reckoning. And one of the reasons your life is at risk is that the global system is so thoroughly interdependent and fragile, really fragile, such that even if you can show data showing enormous progress on literacy and medical and scientific advances and even prosperity and people coming out of poverty and young kids learning to read and African nations getting better, you can tell an optimistic story of civilization. But that data will often obscure the underlying fragility of the system. Right. Which is about a function of interdependence and a function of complex systems only requiring minor changes to create macro major effects. Right. And this makes me think of your critique of, or our critique of liberalism, which tries to hide death at any cost, right? Yeah.
And I guess if your wife is Indian, people who live in India, they burn the corpse, in the open, so that it's a meditation on death. And it seems like this virus, I was thinking, is forcing us into a meditation on death.
If you're feeling that way, you might like this. So when I did the spirituality project, death was one of the themes. The piece of research that I was most taken by was related to a phenomenon known as post-traumatic growth. Yeah. You may have heard of post-traumatic stress, right? Post-traumatic stress, everyone knows about it. It's what military people come back with and we have after trauma and stuff. But post-traumatic growth is a very different phenomenon. It's often people who are close to death, who may have had cancer or may have had an accident.
Yeah.
And they survive it. And then they're like, okay, what was I doing all that time? Given that I now know my life is so fragile, I think I'll live a bit differently. And what the research shows is those who have near-death experiences, not so much in this spiritual, I was looking at my body from above way, but more the kind of, I almost died and I'm not sure I lived the life I wanted to live way.
Yeah.
If you have that experience, what the research shows is people invariably turn towards a life of more intrinsic value, closer connection to nature and loved ones, their own crafts and pursuits, much less concern for status, much less concern for achievement. But here's the killer. Here's the thing that I find very curious about that. It comes about because people realized they almost died and that they were going to die.
Yeah.
But they knew that already, right?
Yeah.
This is the thing that's very bizarre. It's as if the human being...
Well, we know it intellectually, but we don't have a direct encounter with it, or we're not able to digest it or feel it in a full-on way. And once we do, wow, we wake up,
Right. So I guess what I'm saying is, one way of seeing the virus is it's a species-wide encounter with our individual and shared mortality. Mm-hmm. And that could be ultimately a positive thing, although there will be a lot of tragedy and a lot of heartache and pain and literal asphyxiation along the way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's dark and it's a moment of reckoning. It's also something that may pass and be forgotten within 6 months.
Yeah.
But I don't sense that at the moment, but it's possible. Part of the sense-making, part of the intelligibility aspect I mentioned earlier is we don't know how long this is going to last. And that's an unusual situation. We have this feeling that there is a normal reality we have to get back to. But I think what this shows is that normal reality was a kind of fiction.
Yeah, the normal reality is a fiction, and everything's going to change on some level, even if everything appears to be somewhat the same. It seems like there has to be some kind of wide systematic change after this. There's just no question about that. Well, hold on a minute. I'm being too optimistic.
Well,
we could go back to being the same idiots that we were, always. But
we have a lot of immunity to change. Robert Keegan speaks a lot about this, and I wouldn't be surprised how quickly we can hide this under the carpet, as it were, and get about our business. But one way of seeing this, to bring it back to a more religious sensibility, is this is a moment of profound disequilibrium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If our habit energy and our main patterns at a societal level are about going through the motions, this is a moment where we're not allowed to go through the motions. We have to change how we live and think and act and reflect. And what that reminds me of is why Jesus used parables, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems like a different world, but actually there's a connection. So the connection with Jesus using parables, I'd say, is this. Going into the historical context he was in, there are some people who believe that it's not that Jesus studied Piaget as such, but that he sort of recognized that there was something. I say recognize. If this is God, then this language is a bit absurd, but there was something about the person as teacher, as spiritual teacher, that he realized that in this heavily historically religiously loaded time, where you have the Romans and you have the Pharisees and you have the practices and the ritual purity and who's meant to be a Messiah and who's meant to be a rabbi, and comes into all of that context. And he doesn't say, I am this, and this is how things are. He tells lots and lots of stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And why would he do that, right? And the claim is, at least in some of the research,
like in Zen, they do the same thing.
Right. It's a little bit like the koans, right?
Yeah.
So he's deliberately creating disequilibrium, because only in that space of disequilibrium can some new understanding emerge, some new self emerge, some new society emerge.
Right.
So you could see the virus as a kind of opening up of that the disequilibrium, allowing us the time to reflect and withdraw and hopefully transform in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine it'll be both. I mean, for some people will go just nuts, and then other people will go, you know, it's a chance to actually go on retreat. Like, seems to me like, I don't know, as a practicing Buddhist for 20 years, going on retreat is something where you actually go deeper into life. You know, it's not an escape from life. It's actually, you go deeper into life, and it's a chance to do that.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I fear,
for some people, for somebody who
we might be relatively lucky in this regard. I think for others, you've got cramped living quarters.
Exactly.
You have domestic violence. You have, there are other ways of telling the story.
Oh, God.
But I mean, certainly in principle, it affords that opportunity, amongst other things.
Yeah. I mean, you're right to mention that. It could just, people could retreat into their hell, right? Whereas they might have had a way out before.
Yeah.
So it's both things.